In 1993, Deleuze let it be known that he was writing a book called The Grandeur of Marx. It was to be his final book, as he characterized it in an interview with Didier Eribon in Nouvel Observateur. Published days after his death in 1995, this interview has the quality of a final testament, lending weight to the book's announcement, which was accompanied by an undiminished insistence on the importance of Marx. Deleuze here notes that references to Marx run through Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus, as of course they do, and declares that today I can say that I feel completely Marxist. As for the announced book, however, its conditions of possibility seem here considerably more shaky. Deleuze's respiratory ill health left him chained to his oxygen tank, suffering bouts of suffocation, struggling to write. Perhaps even he had lost the desire to write, as he puts it to Eribon. My next book will be titled The Grandeur of Marx. It will be my final book, although these days I no longer have the desire to write. After my book on Marx, I think I'm going to quit writing, at which point I will spend the rest of my life painting. It's unlikely then that much, if any, of this book was written. So was he kidding himself in announcing it? Or perhaps the research, if not the writing, was underway. We don't know. A few of Deleuze's friends have speculated on its content, but of these, Eric Alliez has the best take, I think, calling The Grandeur of Marx an empty square that prompts us to move around and repotentialize the Marx that inheres already in Deleuze's body of work. And that was the prompt for my own book on Deleuze and Marx. But in this talk, I want to do something a little different, and that is to think with and about the grandeur of Marx itself. Now, this might sound paradoxical, but it's a part of the culture of books, for good or ill, that we are drawn to lost books, fabled books, secret books, and in this case, unwritten books. As Giorgio van Straten puts it, they have a powerful air of mystery and of quest, a childlike fascination of that which escapes us, a fascination intensified by the risk of an impossibility, as he quotes Proust. This fascination can be rather too wistful. We lament missing books that would have perfected a writer's extant work, or even changed the course of history. It's a quality evident in and mocked by these social media memes. So here we have The Grandeur of Marx as techno-utopia, liberation through capitalist technology and the white male bourgeois subject and his dog. Or this one, rather more confounding, the course of world history become mycelium rhizome. But if we repel these limitations, missing books also bequeath to us, to their unreaders, the possibility of imagining them, of telling stories about them, of reinventing them, to quote Van Straten again. Or put in Deleuzean vein, they bear and encourage myth-making or fabulation. And fabulation, he knows, is vital for the political praxis of the people who are missing, for the creation of a new earth. Fabulations live in conditions of crisis. They take us up in themselves with an impersonal force of volition, all the more so when their centre is missing. And it's in this way that I want to approach Deleuze's Grandeur of Marx as a fabulation, an approach which is inclusive of, but not limited to, the content of this unwritten book. And my approach will be twofold. First, this fabulation is taken up by the Marxism of Deleuze's late work, his writing around the time of the book's announcement, which will include some zigzagging movement through the communism of Marx's late work and through our own late times. And second, remembering that fabulations for Deleuze can be carried by objects, animals, images, this fabulation will attend to the unwritten book's more formal or artifactual qualities as an experimental publication, and thus engage the question of how the book form of The Grandeur of Marx can be adequate to communism. So, I've referred to ill health and old age as limits placed on Deleuze's capacity to write this book, and they were, clearly, But we can counter-actualize these limits in our fabulation by recalling that Deleuze often identified ill health in others as a condition of philosophical creativity, a creativity with, in intimacy with limits. And his own adult life was hardly one of rude health. Less remarked upon, though, is the place in his thought of old age. And I want to engage with this as a way of thinking of The Grandeur of Marx as a final book, or a midnight book, to take a phrase from Deleuze and Guattari's late book, What is Philosophy? The beautiful opening pages of What is Philosophy evoke an impersonal creativity of old age at the midnight of life. There are times when old age produces not eternal youth, but a sovereign freedom, a pure necessity in which one enjoys a moment of grace between life and death, in which all the parts of the machine come together to send into the future a feature that cuts across all ages. Old age is, of course, an extensive condition, the final years of one's life, but it is foremost, in the rare cases that this is achieved, a string of intensive creations. The given examples are the deserted path of no return, that is Turner's late painting. In cinema, A Witch's Laughter in the Howling Wind, that is Yven's and Loredan's film A Tale of the Wind. And in philosophy, Kant's Critique of Judgment, the mind's faculties overcoming the limits Kant had hitherto painstakingly laid down. And old age is also political. This is very evident, I think, in What is Philosophy. This is old age against old age in power, as they say in that book. So the stakes of old age are high then. One's life doesn't go out with a whimper or an insignificant work, and we should receive the bold declaration of Marx's grandeur in this light. But if all the parts of the machine are to come together in a midnight book, it can't be as a totalizing work. What A Thousand Plateaus disparages as a root book, an encyclopedic and ideational recapitulation of a world external to it. But rather, it has to take the form, in some way, of an A-centered rhizome book, or as a fragment without a whole, or as a little machine coursing with the materiality of the world with which it works and breaks down. So those are three different sort of tropes of the anti-book in Deleuze and Guattari's work. And it's in the spirit of these figures of the anti-book that I'll be sourcing experimental publishing forms for The Grandeur of Marx from Deleuze's late and late-ish, I'm going to cheat a bit, work. And I'll turn to one of those now. Though What is Philosophy is a work of Deleuze's intensive old age, it's the last time that he wrote at that length. His truly old age works, necessitated by his declining health, are his very short late essays, crystalline, almost aphorisms or parables, abrupt in their transitions and endings, as John Rachman describes them. In their content, so that's their form, in their content, these texts take two approaches. In one of these, Deleuze returns to concepts at the heart of his philosophy, immanence, the actual and the virtual, and abstracts these concepts to the clarity of an almost nothing. He planned to collect them in another final book, a slim volume of 4 short essays titled Ensembles and Multiplicities, but they already have a certain published form of their own, and that is of a message in a bottle, as Rachman puts it, borrowing a notion from Adorno that Deleuze elsewhere evokes approvingly. They are messages thrown into the hostile sea of too late capitalist culture, distilled, condensed, intensively curled up upon themselves in the chance of finding and jolting untimely readers. The second approach was realized in only one text. Here, Deleuze availed himself of this short, crystalline form to cut into and beyond his times with a bold and visionary work of political philosophy. It is, of course, 1990's Postscript on Control Societies. The word postscript itself conveying the publishing form of a fragment, at once connected to and independent of a larger text, though, that here is missing or subtracted, and knowingly so. In his interview with Eribon, just before he refers to the grandeur of Marx, Deleuze says of the control essay, it is completely Marxist, even though I discuss things that Marx knew nothing about. So, completely Marxist and a Marxism for our times. I take this to be a chapter of the grandeur of Marx, or a chapter as fragment, or as a message in a bottle. It's certainly the closest we get to Deleuze's thinking about Marx in his last years, and to the form of writing the book might have taken, short, condensed, and abrupt in its transitions and endings. I don't want to spin too much out of the control essay. It's a fragment, not a whole, and fabulations eschew any foundational source, but I'll pick up some of its significant threads and weave them through other works, including the Eribon interview and a 1990 conversation with Tony Negri. To Eribon, Deleuze gives us 4 features of his Marxism at this moment. And he gives us a rationale for writing the grandeur of Marx, or for not writing the grandeur of Marx. First and second, as I've said already, he reminds us of the Marxism that inheres in Capitalism and Schizophrenia, and in the control essay. And second, he reasserts his Marxism, a claim that he had made already in 1990 to Tony Negri. To Negri, he identified his Marxism with the notion that political philosophy must turn on the analysis of capitalism as an immanent system that continually sets and overcomes its limits, only to encounter them on a broader form because its fundamental limit is capital itself. So this establishes his Marxism on firm conceptual foundations in the internal mechanism of Marx's infernal system. So there's no post-Marxism to Deleuze's late work. There's no neo-Gramscianism here. This is at the heart of Marx's thinking. That's where he locates his Marxism. Third, the late assertion of his Marxism is a turn against those who decry Marx as wrong or barbarous or outdated. And fourth, he asserts Marxism as a vital tool for the urgent problems of his times. So he says this: I don't understand it when people try and say that Marx was wrong, and even less when they claim that Marx is dead. There are so many urgent tasks today. We need to try to understand the global market, what it is and how it moves. To do that, one must turn to Marx. So a response to urgent social problems, to the intolerable conditions of his and our times, The Grandeur of Marx is fundamentally a political book. And the figure at the heart of Deleuze and Guattari's politics is the minor or minoritarian, a concept which they explicitly associate with Marx's preeminent political figure, the proletariat. As they write in A Thousand Plateaus, the power of minority, of particularity, finds its figure or its universal consciousness in the proletariat. It is inconceivable, then, that the co-implication of these figures and their value for the urgent problems of our times wouldn't be key to the grandeur of Marx. So I want to take some time here to explore their relation, before showing how Marx's proletariat helps develop Deleuze's figure of the minor today. Both concepts, minor and proletariat, are more radical and confounding than they're sometimes understood to be. Neither names a collective subject, but rather the non- or anti-identitarian condition of being pulled apart by social relations. By being pulled apart by the social relations that course through any minoritarian or proletarian particularity. And they name a politics adequate to this fraught social condition. There's so much to say about these concepts, and of course you know them very well, but I want to concentrate our attention on the place of the social in these figures, starting by contrasting with the majoritarian social relation. So it's the majoritarian which takes the form of identity, individual or collective. The majoritarian describes a system of identities that are constituted in and nurtured by social relations, by the self-bolstering security that class, gender, race, sexuality, citizenship, age, language, ability, and so forth confer upon those who inhabit the privileged position in these social configurations. There is a fit between major identity and the social that paradoxically gives major identity autonomy from the social. For insofar as social relations serve to facilitate and bolster major identities, the social appears at a remove, an inconsequential background for the free play of associating individuals. Hence, Deleuze and Guattari write of the major condition that the individual concern, familial, marital, and so on, joins with other, no less individual concerns, the social milieu serving as a mere environment or background. In the minor condition, the relation between the individual and the social takes a very different form. Minorities are not defined by the smallness of their number. On the contrary, they're numerically the world's majority. Minorities, rather, are those who are positioned unfavourably in relation to those privileged major poles of race, gender, class, and so forth, such that social relations no longer, or never did, facilitate coherent and autonomous identity. The social milieu is not here a mere background, but instead floods individual experience, rendering identity unstable or impossible, as life becomes a tangle of layered and conflicting imperatives and constraints. It's the condition of cramped space, as they put it, where the private affair merges with the social or political immediate. Now, these are bleak, often intolerable conditions with which minorities must grapple if their politics is to have any traction and consequence. But this relation to the social also gives minor politics a wrenching and propulsive force of radical change. Unlike the more or less inconsequential individual concerns of major politics, which, as they put it, where, as they put it, no political intrigue is specifically indispensable or absolutely necessary, but all become one in a large space, cramped space forces each individual intrigue to connect immediately to politics, each individual intrigue to connect immediately to politics. For without a place of its own, without an achieved and satisfied identity accommodated to society, or a positive ground upon which such an identity could be established, minor politics must of necessity push out into the social realm as a whole, as a restless and wrenching engagement with the manifold social relations that cleave through and pull apart each particular minority experience. So while major politics contents itself with fashioning and bolstering the liberty, in Marx's cutting phrase, of the confined individual confined to himself, minor politics recovers the flux of the social, indeed the flux of the natural, the planetary, the cosmic, as the terrain of its practice, thought, and vision, even as or because it is lived as crisis. Now, as to the proletarian nature of this minor condition, there are two moments in Marx which are vital for understanding it, neither of which Deleuze and Guattari refer to. One of these shows how remarkably close what I've just said about the major and the minor relation to the social is to Marx's account of liberal and proletarian social formations. For brevity, you'll have to take my word for that. I'll simply say that Marx defines the proletariat in this minor sense not as a collective subject, but as an impossible condition, a class, as he puts it, of radical chains, chains that are at once the condition of being pulled apart by capital and the condition of its politics, which he describes as the proletariat's restlessness within its very self. I think that's a marvellous formulation. It's restlessness within its very self as it courses with these conflictual social relations that pull it out of shape. The second key reference for understanding the minor relation to the proletariat is a more important step for the grandeur of Marx, because it enables this book to better grasp than Deleuze had done previously the structural determinants of the minor condition, or at least the minor proletarian condition, its traction for our problems today, and the Marxism of some of Deleuze's more gestural and scattered final remarks. We need to return to Deleuze's presentation of the internal dynamic of the capitalist mode of production, upon which he based his Marxism. Now, in Marx's words, capitalist production seeks continually to overcome these immanent barriers but overcomes them only by means which again place these barriers in its way and in a more formidable scale. The real barrier is, of capitalist production is capital itself. Now, it's Marx's explanation for this dynamic that I want to focus on. Deleuze and Guattari follow Marx in part that it's due to the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. I'm going to try and keep the Marxology to the minimum for this late stage in the conference. Owing to how competition between firms increases over time, the ratio of fixed capital to variable capital, machinery to labour. But not untypically for their times, they largely see this as a continuous process, often missing the long-term crisis quality of this tendency and its ramifying effect on the proletariat over time. To cut an ongoing Marxist story short, this increasing ratio of capital to labour, with the increased productivity that it causes, produces crisis. Crisis that is ever harder for capital to climb out of, as the world has been experiencing since the early 1970s. It's a crisis of global manufacturing overcapacity, the consequent shedding of labour from manufacturing, and the incapacity of services to take up enough of that now redundant labour. The effect on the proletariat is to render its existence ever more fraught, fragmented, internally differentiated, and precarious, even as it expands in numerical size. The effect, in other words, is to render the proletariat ever more minoritarian. And so, not only does the capital relation produce the proletariat as a fraught non-identity, pulled out of shape by social relations, it does so ever more dramatically, where in working, the proletariat tendentially undermines its capacity to reproduce itself through work. Or, in Marx's words, the working population, i.e. the proportion of the proletariat able to subject themselves to wage labour, a proportion that, of course, is radically structured by racialization and gender. That proportion of the proletariat produces both the accumulation of capital, of course we know that, but it also produces the means by which it is itself made relatively superfluous. It produces its unworking, it produces its out-of-workness. And it does this to an always increasing extent. In 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari present a number of these empirical features of the minoritarian proletariat, very well, I think, but they don't quite grasp its cause. It's the meaning of their statement that ours is becoming the age of minorities. They very clearly direct that statement to the structural developments in capital. And the point is picked up again in the postscript on control, when he adds into the picture the rapid expansion and subjection of personal debt and the mushrooming of shantytowns and ghettos. Now, true to the crystalline nature of the postscript, it's only one sentence, but it's so important to the thinking of the minoritarian proletariat today. In so locating the socio-historical conjuncture of our age of minorities, 1,000 Plateaus draws from the Italian Marxist currents of operaismo and autonomia, including an important reference to Mario Tronti on the proletariat as the class of self-abolition, the class of the refusal of itself as the subject of work. To struggle against capital, the working class must fight against itself, insofar as it is capital. Now, this has led some commentators, not least Tony Negri himself, to mistakenly claim Negri's post-operaismo work on the multitude to be the development and advance on Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the minor. Indeed, Negri claims knowledge of the content of the grandeur of Marx in related terms. I think he's entirely wrong to do so. For while Hart and Negri define the multitude as an increasingly self-directed process of social production that is autonomous from the command of capital, facilitated by new communication technologies, Deleuze says entirely the opposite. Far from autonomy, the minoritarian, as we've seen, is a condition coursing with and pulled apart by capitalist social relations. It's more productive to fabulate the grandeur of Marx as a moment where Deleuze connects to a different communist current, that of the French ultra-left and its successors. Deleuze tarrying with Gilles Dauvet, perhaps, or picking up a copy of the journal's Theorie Communiste, or if we play with time a little bit, Endnotes. This would draw the grandeur of Marx into the minor literatures of Marxism, the prismatic fringe of little magazines, autodidacts, theory amidst struggles, awkward and obsessive conceptual formulations where all the good stuff happens. There are certainly significant points of resonance with the ultra-left and Deleuze, not least a politics based on the confrontation with internal limits. Or take this minoritarian-sounding definition of the proletariat from the ultra-left, a non-identity pulled apart by deindustrialization. The book title is longer than the quotation in this instance. The proletariat is in itself nothing, but a nothing full of social relations. In its development of minor politics today, the grandeur of Marx must also emerge from research and struggle around the racialization of proletarian conditions and on the life-disqualifying forces of the human and its foundational and self-consolidating anti-blackness. There are enticing points of connection and problematization here between Deleuze's minor and Saidiya Hartman, as was discussed around Claire's paper earlier on today, or with Frank B. Wilderson and Afro-pessimism, not least their shared anti-humanist understanding of a politics founded upon the void or structural impossibility of subjectivity. And here, Afro-pessimism forces the grandeur of Marx to ditch the liberal political figure that the concepts of the minor and the proletariat should already have removed from Deleuze, namely the people to come. The new earth will not be populated by the faux universal subject of the people, however new they may be. But I want to stay with Deleuze's difference with Negri in order to pick out the place therein of communication. A central preoccupation of Deleuze's old age, and a Marxist one at that. For in confrontation with communication, we confront capital and control. When Negri asked Deleuze if in control society there is the possibility for a communist liberation of self-organized communicating minorities, Deleuze responds entirely to the contrary. He says this: communism would be nothing to do with minorities speaking out. Maybe speech and communication have been corrupted. They're thoroughly permeated by money, and not by accident, but by their very nature. We've got to hijack speech. The key thing may be to create vacuoles of non-communication, circuit breakers so we can elude control. Now, this curious vacuole of non-communication leads us to another of the publishing forms of our fabulated book. The problem with communication, as he puts it in his 1985 interview, Mediators, is this. Repressive forces don't stop people expressing themselves, but rather force them to express themselves. Radio and television have spread this spirit everywhere, and we're riddled with pointless talk, insane quantities of words and images. Today, of course, one must insert social media into this equation, where compulsive communication takes shape as a psychoaffective milieu of surveillance, data mining, algorithmic marketing and manipulation, and floods of, and swells of political reaction, and vast monopoly profits. Very much then an urgent problem with a Marxist hue. If Deleuze in this passage seems to sense social media knocking at the door, his own political response to communication takes the form of an excoriating critique of the new philosophers, Bernard-Henri Lévy and other recanting former Maoists turned TV personalities. I'm referring to Deleuze's essay on the new philosophers and a more general problem. From 1977, I'll admit, but as I say, it's very much on the terrain of his old age preoccupations. The new philosophers are the articulation of communication in the realm of intellectual culture. It's a philosophy of big concepts, all puffed up like an abscess, Deleuze writes here, and with a puffed up subjectivity to accompany it. The weaker the thought, the more important the thinker. The expressing subject takes itself all the more seriously in relation to empty propositions. All the efforts of Deleuze's comrades in music, painting, film, science, audiovisual arts, philosophy, and so forth, to undo the author function, are confronted by this wholesale return to the author, as he puts it. An empty and vain subject, the kiss of death for creativity. And this is conjoined with the market. The new philosophers have introduced France to literary or philosophical marketing. You have to talk about the book, or get the book talked about, rather than let the book do the talking. Theoretically, with the new philosophers, you could have all the newspaper articles, interviews, conferences, and radio shows replace the book altogether. It needn't exist at all. Now, I hope you don't think that's what I'm doing here. The grandeur of Marx does exist. It's being fabulated, engaging with urgent political problems, teasing out concepts with fine articulations, as Deleuze counters philosophy to the new philosophers. And it's a book where the author function is displaced and dissipated, for fabulations emerge in between authors' concepts, problems, and struggles, where grandeur is not at all a figure of the puffed-up TV personality, as we'll see in a moment. But if the grandeur of Marx exists against philosophy as marketing, it can't take the form of an unsullied, pre-commercial book, imagined as marketing's kind of opposite, because the book form, no less than communication, is thoroughly permeated by money, and not by accident, but by its very nature. Printed books were the first modern commodities, mechanically produced, uniform across their iterations, and repeatable en masse. They were also integral to the emergence of the industrial division of labour and the production line, and to the separation of intellectual and manual labour, which emerges first through the 18th century separation of the roles of printer as artisan and author as intellectual. And today, books remain fully enmeshed in the latest industrial and technological developments, including warehouse-based online retail, digital rights management, and online advertising routed through the massive data caches of commercial and printed e-books. And so it's an enticing prospect for the published form of the grandeur of Marx that Deleuze's intervention against the new philosophers took shape as a critical experiment in publishing. Publishing as a vacuole of non-communication. For it was published as a pamphlet, distributed for free at the cash points of the bookshops that stocked the new philosophers. Now, a fully Marxist understanding of this pamphlet's material form could learn from Adorno's celebration of the barbaric asceticism of outmoded media, as he puts it, strategically non-synchronous, he writes, with the ostentatious and bludgeoning compound of communication, new technology, and capital. It's an asceticism that paradoxically renders such strategic use of old media as the only truly new, taking on a new timeliness, Adorno writes, of exemption and improvisation. And it's worth noting here that Deleuze's phrase, vacuoles of non-communication, is an uncredited reference to Adorno. Deleuze doesn't go so far as Adorno in reflecting on the political materiality of his pamphlets, but he does, nonetheless, appraise its form as a strike against communication. Encouraged by the enemy to publish his text in a newspaper, Deleuze detects a trap. As he explains in a letter of strategy to Guattari, the problem is how to make an effective attack that doesn't become a moment in a prolonged polemical and self-promotional flow of communication. That is a part of precisely what the text seeks to oppose. Such, as he disparages it, are the laws of the newspaper genre. It's his publisher who suggests the alternative of a short pamphlet, whose benefits Deleuze sets out like this. A pamphlet exists like a book. I mean, he's wrong there, but for this point, we'll allow him that. A pamphlet exists like a book, such that the attacks that ensue, no matter how personal, necessarily take the form of a book review, to which we are not forced to respond. The relationship of force with the newspaper is reversed to our advantage. And against the attacks, denunciations, and score settling that are inherent to a newspaper polemic, the pamphlet would bring positive things to the fore, namely his and Guattari's political concepts, from which our attacks would flow without losing their violence. It's a samizdat situation, as he describes it, this pamphlet himself elsewhere, a guerrilla or minor publication in and against the hostile terrain of communication. Now, there are other formal features of Deleuze's Marxism evident in the New Philosopher's text, which are valuable for our urgent problems, though I'm just going to skip through them quickly. He declares an opposition to political and aesthetic cliques and schools, with their puffed-up popes and self-regarding manifestos, quite the opposite of the proletariat as self-abolition. They are the version in miniature of the identitarian structures of the Soviet state and its satellite communist parties. About these, the declaration in 1,000 Plateaus of the proletariat as universal figure of minoritarian becoming makes short shrift. But as long as the working class identifies itself by an acquired status, or even by a theoretically conquered state, it appears only as capital, a part of capital, variable capital, and does not yet leave the plan or the plane of capital. Deleuze's New Philosopher's pamphlet also cuts against democracy, another urgent problem for the grandeur of Marx to grapple with. What social democracy has not given the order to fire when the poor came out of their territory or ghetto, they write in What is Philosophy? A book which reveals democracy as the political ground of communication and capital. In the pamphlet, democracy is described as a grid laid out across social space that seduces, channels, and formats social and political life for the perpetuation of capital. Elections are not a particular locale nor a particular day of the calendar. They are more like a grid that affects the way we understand and perceive things. Everything is mapped back on this grid and gets warped as a result. Above all else, democracy formats in the denunciation and disqualification of revolution. This is an integral function and internal motor of the New Philosophers. Their subjectivity constructed through denunciation of 68. Everything is filtered through this electoral grid. Marxism, Maoism, socialism, etc., and not because the actual struggles have revealed new enemies, new problems, or new solutions. It's simply because the revolution must be declared impossible everywhere and for all time. This also explains why the thinking subject has made a comeback. The only possibility of revolution, as far as the New Philosophers are concerned, is the pure act of the thinker who thinks revolution is impossible. Revolution, a term that Deleuze uses a lot, as you know, revolution is not progress. And on this point, the grandeur of Marx is an important moment of Deleuzean self-critique, which zigzags us back to Marx's old age and his own self-critique therein. I'm reluctant to mention it, but recall the moment a decade ago or so of left accelerationism, a clear case of philosophy as marketing, if you'll excuse me. But one that was premised, we must admit, on a line from Anti-Oedipus. Only one line, but still, a line from Anti-Oedipus. Not to withdraw from the process of capitalist deterritorialization, but to go further to accelerate the process. Yawn. This echoes the young Marx of the Communist Manifesto, a Promethean faith in the liberatory power of the forces of production. It took time for Marx to throw this off, which he did only in fits and starts, but it was gone for good by the time he edited the French translation of Capital in the early 1870s. That's a long time before accelerationism. Marx had ditched all of this stuff. Here, And in associated texts, he makes it explicit that it's incorrect to view the forces of production as primary and progressive. On the contrary, techno-productive forces are formed by and patterned from within by capitalist social relations, providing nothing in and of themselves which is liberatory, quite the reverse. To think otherwise is to be the left wing of capital, or indeed the right wing for that matter. It is not to be communist, which involves the abolition of the capitalist configuration of the human metabolism with planetary life, and the radical reconstruction of new techno-social modes of being, a new earth, in Deleuze's visionary phrase. Marx spent his last 10 years exploring the consequences of this shock to his conceptual system, as Kohei Sato and others have shown. It's a period also without a book, or with an unwritten book, or with notebooks. These notebooks are largely comprised of quotation and paraphrase from a vast archive of contemporary research on non-Western and pre-capitalist social formations, and what we would today call ecological sciences. Because of the left-wing fetishization of productive forces, from Lenin and Mao to social democracy, these notebooks have been mostly dismissed as an old age Marx who had lost his critical powers. But they are, on the contrary, Marx's old age against old age in power. The moment when all the parts of the machine come together, overcoming errors or limits, teasing out a non-Western, anti-progressive, eco-communism, a communist horizon which is only now coming into view, into our view. Could the grandeur of Marx have taken the form of, or could the grandeur of Marx take the form of notebooks? One hopes, but after the publication of the third and final volume of Deleuze's collected short texts, it seems unlikely. In a sense, though, something of Marx's notebooks is already evident in Deleuze's corpus, and that is in the form, content, and sensibility of 1,000 Plateaus. Here, the linear and manifesto-like structure of Anti-Oedipus is replaced with intensive plateaus, non-linear blocks of text at once tightly curled and flying out, to be reconfigured in any order, plateaus that cut against chronological time in their exploration of manifold social, geological, technological, signifying, aesthetic, and cosmic modes of being. It is, if you will, a notebook, or a workbook, or an anti-workbook that shoots off in all directions to explore, in the finest conceptual and empirical way, other worlds to the deadening world of capital. And it does so with a visionary intensity and sensibility that we could call utopian, if we use that word sparingly. Marx's late notebooks are much more closely tied to scientific analysis of the contemporary problems than is the freewheeling 1,000 Plateaus, his analysis of the breakdown of the human and natural metabolism, of natural science and agriculture, and, enticingly, of the possibility of the extant Russian peasant commune as a pre-capitalist ground for post-capitalist communism. But there's a visionary, utopian quality here too, as he casts around outside of the West and back in time for the building blocks, or simply the conditions of existence of other modes of being, other metabolisms that might teach us something for the emancipation of the senses. Perhaps then it's in Marx's late notebooks that we find the closest precursor to 1,000 Plateaus. And if these two sets of writing are held together in the grandeur of Marx, our fabulation pushes Marx to more utopian explorations and Deleuze to a more developed ecology. Those explorations of geology and becoming animal tipping into an eco-communism for our too late times. I want to shift now to the book's title, the meaning here of grandeur, and then close with the grandeur of the word communism. In one sense, the title gives us the book already published, in and as its announcement, that is, the book as slogan. It's a slogan launched against late capitalist society in the 1990s, and perhaps also against the merely oblique way that it was then seemed permitted to read Marx in philosophy, where Deleuze's affirmative grandeur is posited against the mere spectres of Derrida's contemporaneous book. But there's more to it than that. Jean-Claude Martin has commented on the choice of title via Hegel, but while sharing some of his interpretation, I prefer to approach it through Deleuze's political commitment to Palestinian liberation, since this is certainly one of those urgent problems of his and our times. And books of philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari write, must contain their sum of unimaginable sufferings. The direct connection here, of course, is Deleuze's essay, The Grandeur of Yasser Arafat, the title of one of his half-dozen short, precise and impassioned texts on Palestinian struggle and Zionist settler colonialism. This particular text was published a year after the Israeli-backed massacres in the Sabra and Shatila neighborhood and refugee camp in Beirut in 1982, while Arafat, the then fabled leader of the PLO, was holed up in exiled isolation in Tripoli. From the perspective of Palestinian liberation, there are problems with Arafat, which Deleuze doesn't pick out, but he gives us here the meaning and traction of grandeur as it applies to Arafat and Palestinian struggle. Grandeur is not a quality of victors, of majorities, but of the oppressed, of minorities, of the people who are missing. And the Palestinians are quintessentially a missing people. Their non-existence is integral to Israel's ever-recharged colonial myth of a people without a land for a land without a people, and to the expulsion, brutalization, torture, maiming, and murder that ensues on this myth, namely Israel's apartheid and settler colonial expansion. It is, in Deleuze's framing, an intolerable situation, affectively experienced as shame. Arafat's shame at being unable to prevent the massacre, Palestinian shame in the face of 75 years of expulsion and occupation, our shame insofar as we're critical witnesses without effect, the shame of being alive amidst all this intolerable. Shame is double-edged, though. It's a precondition for and provokes grandeur. Deleuze defines grandeur as the passion and image of a great historical character. Risking Eurocentrism, he writes that it's as if Arafat stepped out of Shakespeare. But if Arafat or anyone else bears grandeur, it's not grounded in the self-presence of an individual, but is fabulated out of collective struggle against the intolerable, against shame, with shame. And it's necessary to that struggle, grandeur is necessary to that struggle, given the enforced evacuation of any other conditions upon which minorities might ground and project themselves. It is their hallucinatory being, he says. Or as he says of T.E. Lawrence, it is a tendency to project into things, into reality, into the future, and even into the sky, an image of himself and others, so intense that it has a life of its own, an image that is always stitched together, patched up, continually growing along the way, to the point at which it becomes fabulous. It is a machine for manufacturing giants. Marx's grandeur, then, is not the Marx of the individual or the great man of communist history, but is a collective and impersonal. It is in between Marx and struggles, Marx and political philosophy, Marx and the proletariat, Marx and us. And grandeur carries risks, too, which we should be attentive to, very much so, as we patch it together along the way. The individualization of grandeur's impersonality is one of these risks, a risk which Marx, true to his grandeur, himself forewarns. He says this, right at the end of his life. Both of us scoff at being popular, he writes to Bloss. Among other things, our disgust at any personality cult is evidence of this. When Engels and I first joined the secret society of communists, we did it on the condition that they repeal all statutes that would be favorable to a cult of authority. Marx's grandeur, if you'll allow me, is a cult of anti-personality. But what then of communism? And this is my final point. It's not a word that Deleuze adheres to. And with some cause, since it was then heavily occupied by the anti-revolutionary forces of the Soviet bloc and its Communist Party outposts. which Deleuze famously never joined. I understand his choice, but I don't agree with it. Neither does our fabulation of his book, for it would be to botch the sovereign freedom of old age to omit this imminent horizon of Marx's work, the precondition and consequence of his thought, practice, and vision. Marx is not always communist. In various moments, he's racist, progressivist, humanist, and social democratic. But these moments are invariably when he has lost hold on the communist horizon. Communism is what holds Marx to his highest level of philosophical and political intensity and acuity. So, how can we draw Deleuze's grandeur of Marx into communism? I'm going to do that far too briefly with the help of Maurice Blanchot, an important, if occasional, interlocutor for Deleuze, including in Deleuze's old age. Blanchot gives us an exquisite definition of communism, which he fashions directly from the non-identity of the proletariat. He writes, "Communism is what excludes and excludes itself from every community already constituted. In other words, it's a movement of absolute becoming, to quote Marx, or what Deleuze calls pure immanence, occasionally utopia, more often revolution, and a new earth, but only, to quote what is philosophy, insofar as it connects with what is real here and now in the struggle against capitalism." Communism as such is not a distinct moment in the grandeur of Marx, but the book's condition and volition, integral to its force of fabulation. Communism is integral too to this book's overcoming. For, in Blanchot's hands, communism gives us a final version of the grandeur of Marx's published form. Blanchot's statement of the non-identity of communism is evacuated of his own identity, appropriately enough, for it was made anonymously in Comité, the single-issue journal of the May 68 Student and Writers' Action Committee, which Blanchot co-founded. Another of his communist texts in Comité celebrates the publications of the uprising, publications that bore the rupture of 68 into their material published form. He writes this anonymously: "Tracts, posters, bulletins, words of the street, infinite words, effective or not, they belong to the decision of the instant. They do not say everything, on the contrary, they ruin everything. They are outside of everything. They act and reflect fragmentarily, like words on the wall. They are written in insecurity, received under threat. They carry the danger themselves in their forms." Well, these fleeting, fragmentary, ruptural publishing forms are not an addition to the book. For Blanchot, they are the communist overcoming of books, where books, as he puts it, are, and I love this from a literary critic, a refined form of oppression. All these books, all the books published hot on the heels of 68, you can just picture it, the publishing industry going into overdrive at the end of May 68, whether as epitaph, analysis, celebration, condemnation, they all contributed to the same end, the summation and the closure of the uprising. This was an effect consequent on the very form of the book, Blanchot argues, where the rupture was corralled by established explanatory frameworks, claimed by authorized authors, and fashioned into standardized formats, narrative structures, and marketable book commodities. And so he declares, no more books, never again a book, so long as we maintain our relation with the upheaval of the rupture. Well, what this wrenching standard gives us is not an explanation for why the grandeur of Marx remained unwritten, albeit that I'm tempted to go down that line. Rather, it gives us a communist ground or an unground for its fabulation, a fabulation that must cleave to the fraught minorities, urgent problems, and ruptures of our times. A fabulation also in publishing form, in publishing experiments from which the book is subtracted or overcome. A book, in other words, or an anti-book that is adequate to Marx's grandeur, adequate to Deleuze's old age against old age in power. Thank you.